I had different experiences with the Sabbath growing up. They're largely all positive. When I was young, my sister and I would often just play around the house. My parents would go take their Sabbath afternoon naps after coming back from potluck at church. And, we were never really that into naps when we were young kids, and so we would often get into the cupboards, and somehow we would always end up taking out the blender, and whatever fruit or ice we could find, we'd end up making smoothies or something with the blender. My memories always seem to remember a blender on our Sabbath afternoons as my parents were taking a nap. As I got a little bit older, we got into Pathfinders, right? And so our Sabbaths consisted of Sabbath church, then potluck, and then Pathfinders afterwards. And then even after Pathfinders, my parents would stick around with the other parents. They'd sit and talk until the sun would go down. Me and my sister and our friends that were in Pathfinders there would again get into the cupboards at church. Somehow always there's a blender involved. We'd take out the blender and we'd rummage through the Pathfinder closet to see what sort of syrups we could find, and we'd make ourselves little snow cones. Even at a very young age, we started making some really good snow cones. It's probably why I'm still addicted to them today. But Sabbaths were always quite busy, if not a little bit exhausting growing up. But they're some of my favorite memories, and I've built the strongest relationships with some of my friends through what happened on our Sabbaths. We would go to church, potluck, Pathfinders, and once the sun set, we'd go, all of us, out to pizza with 4 or 5 families that were all in our Pathfinders. And we'd play video games until in the pizza arcade until 10 o'clock at night. It was an all-day thing, right? Some of the other memories I have about growing up and the Sabbath often include the ideas of what we should and should not do, right? I'm sure most of you have had a similar experience growing up as an Adventist. We value the Sabbath so much, and we remember what we should and shouldn't do. But Sabbath keeping, and what I want us to kind of talk about over the next week or so, is that Sabbath keeping has so much more to do than do's and don'ts. Sabbath is about making a statement. It's about building a peculiar identity for ourselves amid a much larger public identity. It's about maintaining and enacting a counter identity that sort of refuses a mainstream identity. The Sabbath is all about this sort of bodily act of testimony and this bodily alternative and resistance to all of the pervading cultural values that we kind of put ourselves up against. We challenge the assumptions behind so many of our mainstream values in our Sabbath observance. Sabbath is so much more about what we can and can't do. While those things are important, I think Adventists, we kind of sometimes struggle with reimagining and reigniting a passion that flows from a Sabbath. Inevitably, the Sabbath, its value, its importance, kind of fluctuates during different seasons of our life. One of my favorite authors, Oliver Sachs, a man who grew up Jewish, then left his faith, his family, his cultural identity, moved to Venice Beach, lived there for many years, and then reflecting back on his life at the very end, thinking about the Sabbath as a stage of his life, he sees the Sabbath differently on his deathbed, and he recognizes perhaps the Sabbath could have meant so much more to my life. Rather than rejecting it all right as a religious observance, he sees a sort of meaning behind it that surpasses all of the temptations that we have today. And we're going to be talking about some of these things this morning. And we're going to be doing it by way of looking at Deuteronomy 5 and this recommitment to the covenant that God has made towards the Israelites. Because remember, last week we talked about the Sabbath as needing to be part of the narrative. We need to read and understand the Sabbath as part of a narrative. When God called the Israelites out of Egypt, he calls them also to remember the place, the conditions, the slavery, the oppressive forces that were upon them. And he says, remember all of these things because I'm going to stand starkly against all of these things. Last week's focus was a little bit more about how God at the Tower of Babel was so reluctant to allow humans the ability to form their own forms of government, which inevitably becomes the status that we have or the environment that we have today. But here God is wanting to remind the Israelites of their covenant relationship with one another. At this point in the story, the Israelites have already broken the covenant. God has taken them out of Egypt in the book of Exodus. He's given them the 10 Commandments, and he's in this conversation with Moses for quite a long time. And during that period, the Israelites at the bottom of Mount Sinai are starting to get angsty. They're getting anxious. They're forgetting. They're remembering their past. They're getting fearful of their future. And they feel, let us make gods for ourselves. It's interesting because it's such a human temptation. Here we see the Israelites, and we might be tempted to just look down on them for it. But if we're honest, it's such an easy thing to do, to make gods for ourselves in moments and times where we feel uncertain. And for the Israelites, this took the shape of building a golden calf, right? They collected all of their jewelry, they melted it all together, and they created a golden calf for them to worship, a symbol of security, a hope for them, right? And for us today, we're not all that different, but instead of collecting jewelry or building an altar or carving something out of stone, what we're tempted to do is to accumulate for ourselves, to provide security for ourselves, to make sure our savings accounts are ready for rainy days ahead, to ensure the longevity of our security. It's something that's very natural. It's something that's very human. And there's nothing really to say that's inherently bad about worrying about our safety and our security, but it's a question of to what extent and what are we placing before ourselves here. The Sabbath is a core commandment in God's vision of our futures. After reiterating the importance of the Sabbath and connecting it with our own harvest and plowing times, which is to say, in some words, our own security and our own well-being and our own need for self-preservation, the Israelites eventually, they come to the Jordan River and they're ready to enter at long last the promised land. Here I am skipping ahead quite a bit. But at this point, it had been a long time since Mount Sinai. And so Moses here, he stops at the Jordan in the book of Deuteronomy, and he gives Israel instruction for this new land. He gives them instruction that lasts quite a bit. It lasts for 30 chapters. Moses here speaks for so long because he regards this move into this promised land as incredibly important event in the life of the Israelites. And this new high-risk venture, it's going to bring its own set of temptations. And he wants to make sure that the Israelites understand that the old desert covenant that God has made still pertains to the agriculture and the harvest, everything that's expected in this new land. Remember when God described this new land to the Israelites, this place that he had set aside for them, he described it as this place of great abundance, right? And the Israelites, they have that in mind, and Moses has that in mind as he's kind of getting the Israelites ready to cross into this new land, into this new territory that they're about to enter, a land that is already claimed by all other gods, which is why Yahweh finds it important here to make sure that God identifies God's self over and against all of the other gods that they're going to come across in this new land of Canaan. In this new land that, again, is going to be fertile, and this fertility of the land is going to be a huge temptation and a huge seduction for Israel. Moses knows the affluence of the land. And he knows what's happened in this Israelite history so far. And he knows that this affluence is going to be a temptation, a lure for the Israelites, for their covenant faith that he wants them to hold steady to. What could be a temptation in this promised land, right? Well, for starters, because this land is so fertile and because it's so abundant and the promise of abundance is there, the temptation is clearly that the Israelites might think that now they can manage on their own. They will be tempted to be autonomous, away from this Yahweh. Remember what happened at the Tower of Babel last week. The people saw their own well-being, their ability to build and structure themselves, their prosperity in that valley as a sign of their own work, of their own labor, a success of their own labor. And Moses here, a good reader of the past and a predictor of his future, remembers that prosperity breeds a sense of amnesia. He wants Israel to be wary of such amnesia. If you look at chapter 6, verse 12, he says, "Take care that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Again, in chapter 8, he says, "Then do not exalt yourself, forgetting the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." The fear being that the Israelites, they might forget where they came from, the circumstances that they had departed from, the way that they were able to get away. They might forget all of that because they are now entering into a place, into a location that they might find great abundance in. Moses anticipates that they might forget that it was God who emancipated them from the labor, the system, the coercion of Pharaoh's land. Often with abundance comes the sense of security and safeness. We're happy with ourselves. And if Israel can only increase its productivity in this land, it might be safer and happier. These are some of the temptations that the Israelites are facing as they're coming into a land about acquisition. Acquisition might be something that will be on their mind. But something that Moses wants to remind these people is, how can God's people, how can the Israelites be attentive to their neighbors if they see their neighbors as competitors? He wants the Israelites to remember that being a part of this land might produce a sense of competition, and they might forget their covenantal neighborliness, which God has instituted. Remember the Ten Commandments, part of them were about our relationship with God, and the others were all about our neighborliness. These are the two things that God is closely attuned to. Here, as they're entering the promised land, Moses wants them to remember the contrast that God has set up between the land of Pharaoh and this land that God is wanting to bring them to. These systems, these point of views that we must see differently. Again, the call to remember is a call to remember that everything that we have, everything that we own is inheritance for us. And this is what Moses is bringing up for the Israelites here. This is an inheritance, because in the land of Pharaoh, all they talked about was the land of possession. The land was possessed by Pharaoh, and all the wealth went to Pharaoh, and all of these things, right? And the Israelites might be tempted to look at this new promised land as a land of possession, that they now own this land that they've been blessed with because God has given it to them. God has set it apart for them. So now this is ours. It might ring some bells of the prosperity gospel, right? A prosperity that some preachers advocate here in the United States. Everything that is given to us is part of our possession because God has given it to us. And so we own all of these things, right? But here Moses is, again, shifting the narrative. He wants them to remember that this land is inheritance. God has brought them from a place to this new place, and they're inheriting this land. Because when we look at land as inheritance, when we look at what God has given us as inheritance, when we notice our blessings as an inheritance, it changes our mindset about how we share, how we live, how good of a neighbor we are. If we see what we've been given as inheritance, then we're more likely to share what we've been given. But in their amnesia, Israel may forget that its covenantal framework, its reference of what God has done for them at this time, they might be tempted to think that this might be anti-neighborly just so that they could acquire more and more. And so in that way, Moses asserts in chapter 5 that the Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. All of us here alive this day. The covenant is for that generation. He wants them to remember that the center of that covenantal teaching in the Bible is that it's not a rat race, this new land that they're going into. Rather, the goal is this covenant, this enterprise for the sake of the whole community. In chapter 5, it says in the story, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock. or the resident alien in your town, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Here we see the covenantal nature of the Sabbath re-emphasized here once again. If you compare it with what was given in Exodus 20 with the Ten Commandments, you'll see here in Deuteronomy 5 that it's largely the same, but there's a small phrase that's different. You'll notice that it still is a call for all to rest: sons and daughters, slaves, oxen, donkeys, livestock, immigrants. But a phrase is added here at the very end, that they may rest like you. Sabbath is the great equalizer, the day of equality where all are called to equally be at rest. Not all are equal during the week. Not all are equal in systems of production, right? Not all perform in the same ways. Others achieve higher status because of how much they perform or don't perform, to what degrees of success we can owe our labor, right? But on Sabbath, all rest alike. All are called equally to rest. In a society that's defined by production and consumption, there are gradations of performance and consumption, and therefore there's different gradations of significance and worth. But in a social system where everyone is called to rest, it radically changes the way that we view our covenantal neighborliness. The Sabbath acts directly against our current social system, where everyone is kind of coerced to perform better here, to produce more, consume more, be better shoppers, value the things that you have, and notice the things that you don't have, right? We value things as significant and insignificant. We value people as rich and poor, people with access, people without access. But the Sabbath breaks all of these gradations that we have. Because on the Sabbath, you do not have to do more. You do not have to sell more. You do not have to control more. You do not have to know more. You don't have to be younger than what you are. You don't have to be older than what you are. You don't have to be more beautiful. You don't have to score more. Because this is the day that breaks all of those patterns. This is the day that all are like you, equal worth, equal value, equal access, equal rest. We recall that at Sinai it was a command to rest, for the Creator rested on the seventh day. But not here. Here the motivation for a Sabbath is not creation. Moses in Deuteronomy says to rest because remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the seventh day. Remember the Exodus. Remember the coercive system that Pharaoh had you enslaved to. Remember the brick quota that you were supposed to fulfill, the straw that you were supposed to collect. And he warned them. He said, if you forget all of this, remember you are inevitably going to fall into this temptation to give your life over to another coercive, competitive system in this new and prosperous land. How do we who live in a very prosperous land rest? What sort of Sabbath rest are we called to in a land such as ours? I think this is the mistake, and what I'm trying to connect with my beginning story. We often, in our attempt, in our affluence, in our prosperity, in our security, we boil down the Sabbath into do's and don'ts when the Sabbath is all about neighborly covenant. The Sabbath, you are free. And if you don't remember that covenant and that covenantal memory, you fall into the trap of what one should do, what one should not do, what one should create and what one should not create. In Deuteronomy, this is a big concern for Moses. He's big on remembering for this very reason, because he sees what the Israelites are walking towards. He tells them over and over and over again, just remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and all of Egypt. Remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt and diligently observe these statuses. Remember you were a slave in the land of Egypt, therefore I am commanding you to do this. He says, remember the pattern of this world has been broken. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and thought, oh man, I didn't finish this. I need to get into work early so I can complete that. Have you ever woken up in an anxious panic because you were having a dream about bills that you needed to pay, deadlines that you needed to meet? Perhaps you wake up from nightmares about not being in the place that you wish you would have been at this time period in your life. Constantly, you beat yourself up for not being where you wish you were. Well, Sabbath here is a break from all of that. The Sabbath is an opportunity to recall what Egypt and Pharaoh constantly do to our lives, and then to remember that Yahweh and God's Exodus have called us into a different place. The Sabbath is the day where we can find a voice to sing that we are free, free at last, that nobody is going to turn me around and bring me back to Egypt. Some might say that those who observe the Sabbath are less driven. They miss out on an entire day. But rather, the truth of the matter is those who observe the Sabbath are less coerced. They're less frantic to meet deadlines. They are free to be rather than free to do. Here in America, we have the conversation, I think, all wrong. Our conversations all center about what we are free to do, but the Sabbath is calling us to remember what we are free to be. The Sabbath is this great festival of freedom when Pharaoh and all of these expectations are dismissed, thrown away to the bottom of the waters. It's given as a free gift to reflect and to remember the call of freedom that God has in our lives. It's why God institutes this thing about sevens in the Bible. It's a really fascinating thing, because Sabbath takes on a whole new reality in the life of the Israelites. It's not just about one day of worship. It's about 7 days form the very life of Israelites. It's why they have the year of Jubilee. It's why they give the land harvest. It's why slaves are freed on the 7th year. The Sabbath reminds Israelites about the freedom and the abundance in who God is, not in who or what we do. In this vein, in understanding the Sabbath in this way, in this sort of interpretation, the Sabbath is not simply a pause from our daily week where we get to rest for a day, go to church, take our naps, and then just get ready for Sunday because the week starts all over again. It's not just a pause of our week, although that's incredibly important. The Sabbath and the values and the call to freedom is then, at this moment, thus an occasion for reimagining all social life away from systems of coercion. It makes us remember what is actually valuable today. What are we working for? We work so hard for our families, but do we spend time with our families, right? We work so hard to impress our friends, but do we know, how intimately do we know our friends? Do we know their struggles? Do we know their vulnerabilities? Have we been able to build that relationship with them? If the Sabbath is a pause, it's a pause for transformation. As the Israelites face this new land of abundance, of being able to acquire all of this security, Moses gives them a pause and he says, remember the Sabbath day. Because in it, this is your identity. A reminder that your humanity derives from your being connected to God, not connected to anything that you do or make or produce during the week. Sabbath is the great equalizer. It has the potential, the ability to transform the very way that society works. But unfortunately, it's just simply become a day to go to church at times. The Sabbath, I urge you this call to remember where God has led us out from, where God is leading us out from currently, the pharaohs and the burdens of today. May the Sabbath be a day of reorientation, of reimagining, of covenantal neighborliness. The blessing of the Sabbath comes in that, in recognizing that on the seventh day, God stopped, paused, not just to rest, but to be moved and affected by all that he was surrounded by. May we, in the same way, stop, notice everything that we are surrounded by, and definitely give thanks for what we have, but also remember that God is calling us to much greater things. The Sabbath is calling us outside of ourselves to actively build relationships and to define our humanity in our mutual neighborliness. As we continue to explore the Sabbath, I hope you take one of these lessons with you this week. Who am I building covenants with? Is it with my work? Is it with my consumption, my production, whatever the case may be? Or is it with the people, the land, what God has given me as inheritance? May you have a happy Sabbath. May you be well. And we'll see you again next time. Good morning and happy Sabbath, church. Thanks for joining us here this morning. We hope that you've been well. If you're joining us for the first time, please check out our website where there's plenty of information of other services that you can join us for. If you're joining us again as a member or you've been with us before, we're glad to have you and to be with you this Sabbath morning. For all who watch, we have some special events coming up soon, and we hope that you can join us. Check out our website for more information. Like I said, it will all be posted there. We hope to see you soon. We hope that you're all doing well, and I want to wish you a happy Sabbath.